when you talk to American media, they don't have a sense of history. They don't have a sense that we made a deal. What bothers me deeply is that the United States doesn't seem to understand what a war is, that a war could happen very easily now.
You have met Vladimir Putin, you have talked to him. What do we get wrong about him?
Well, the one thing they get wrong about him is that they make him into a Hitler, a Saddam, somebody who's dangerous, who has plans for expansion in the West. I have never felt that, never even talk about it.
Grüezi miteinander, ganz herzlich willkommen und einen wunderschönen guten Tag, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde aus nah und fern, von wo aus auch immer Sie uns zuschauen mögen. Ich freue mich, Ihnen heute eine ganz besondere Sondersendung von Weltwoche Daily, die andere Sicht, präsentieren zu können. Ich hatte die Gelegenheit, ein längeres Gespräch zu führen mit dem legendären amerikanischen Hollywood-Regisseur Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone gehört fraglos zu den überragenden Filmemachern unserer Zeit, auch zu den erfolgreichsten. 3-mal hat er den Oscar gewonnen, 11-mal ist er nominiert worden. Ein Großmeister vor allem des politischen, des provokativen, des kritischen Kinos. Seine Werke sind in die Leinwandgeschichte eingegangen. Und nur ein paar Namen hier zu rekapitulieren: Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, Wall Street, JFK, Nixon, W. Alexander. Zuletzt ist Oliver Stone mit aufsehenerregenden Dokumentarfilmen hervorgetreten, mit Interviews, die er geführt hat mit bedeutenden Persönlichkeiten der Zeitgeschichte, mit Fidel Castro, mit Hugo Chavez und allem voran mit dem russischen Präsidenten Wladimir Putin. Über 2 Jahre hinweg hat er sich immer wieder mit Putin getroffen und das verdichtet in ein 4-stündiges Gespräch, ein zeitgeschichtliches Dokument erster Güte. Jetzt geht er an den Start am Festival von Cannes dieser Tage mit einem brandneuen Film, mit einer Dokumentation über den brasilianischen Präsidenten Lula, den er auch intensiv befragt hat, im Bemühen, ihn zu verstehen, ihn zu erklären. Lula, eine ganz schillernde, eine hochinteressante Figur, ein Politiker der Linken, der in Brasilien in höchste Ämter aufstieg, dann ganz tief fiel, ins Gefängnis musste, aus dem Gefängnis Phönix, aus der Asche wieder zurückkam und jetzt in Erscheinung tritt als Brückenbauer, als Friedensstifter, als neutraler Ausbalancierer da in diesem neuen Kalten Krieg, vor allem auch als Repräsentant jener multipolaren Weltordnung, die sich da auflehnt gegen die Hegemonialbestrebungen der Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika, mit denen sich Oliver Stone so kritisch auseinandersetzt. Wir haben natürlich uns über diesen neuen Film unterhalten, über die Faszinationskraft von Lula, über die Bedeutung auch dieser multipolaren Ambitionen, zum Beispiel von Brasilien. Aber wir sind dann relativ schnell umgestiegen auf den Ukraine-Krieg, der Oliver Stone intensiv beschäftigt. Wir haben über die Ursachen dieses Kriegs gesprochen. Ich habe ihn gefragt, wie er Putin heute einschätzt, wie er die Ukraine sieht, Präsident Zelensky, die Rolle der Amerikaner selbstverständlich, Washingtons und sehr pessimistisch und fast entsetzt, ja fassungslos hat sich Oliver Stone über Europa geäußert. Da sei die Politik zusammengebrochen wie ein Kartenhaus. Man habe sich da in die NATO hineintreiben lassen, in diese Stellvertreterkriege. Das sei brandgefährlich und die Welt rücke einer nuklearen Katastrophe täglich näher und das wolle man nicht wahrhaben und das sei sehr, sehr bedrohlich. Ich habe dann immer wieder versucht, sozusagen den Silberstreifen am Horizont zu packen. Es ist ein eher düsteres Gespräch geworden, aber hochinteressant und die Ehrlichkeit dieses hochdekorierten Filmemachers, die hat mich sehr, sehr beeindruckt. Oliver Stone ist ja ein Mann, der auch ein sehr intensives und interessantes Leben geführt hat. Er ist der Sohn aus wohlhabendem Haus, sein Vater Amerikaner, die Mutter Französin. Er hat hervorragende Universitäten besucht, ist dann aus der Uni rausgegangen, hat sich freiwillig gemeldet für den Vietnamkrieg, kehrte hoch dekoriert und ernüchtert nach Hause, hat das dann später auch verarbeitet in mehreren Filmen und schließlich dann eben eine ganz große Laufbahn gemacht als Drehbuchautor und Filmregisseur. Auch Bücher hat er geschrieben. Und ich habe mich sehr gefreut, einmal mit ihm so sprechen zu können, ungezwungen und gerade heraus. Und ich lade Sie ein, diesem Gespräch zu folgen. Hier im Anschluss schauen Sie rein, wie Oliver Stone die Weltläufe beobachtet. Let's start with your new film, which you will present in Cannes these days. It's about the Brazilian president Lula.
Yeah.
What fascinates you about him? What's the interesting thing about President Lula?
Well, it's some story. It's unique, I think, in recent history here. And first of all, he's the first union president that I know of who's been elected president and has done a great job. He had two terms of successful terms in the early part of the century, and two 4-year terms. And as you know, he was put into jail when he was running for the third term in 19, was it? 18.
Mm-hmm.
He was miraculously, I think, in many ways, saved from jail. He spent 18 months there, and then he came out and ran for office, and he barely won against the right-wing candidate Bolsonaro, who had been president who benefited from his absence in the previous election. So it's a fairy tale in the sense that he came back from the dead, was revived by frankly a hacker who went into the accounts of the prosecuting attorneys and found that there was a lot of misbehavior on the part of the prosecutors on Lula, and that they were falsifying information, and that, in other words, it was what they call lawfare in South America. It's a form of controlling elections through media and through legal suits, which is a new way of fighting. But it's very interesting to watch how that works. So there's a lot of variables on this story, but above all, he's a very warm person who I got to know in 2009 when I was making South of the Border. Chavez was very close with him, and he was a big part of that movement of the presidents of various countries to bring South America up to a modern standard. And to this day, Lula's still in BRICS. I think he went back into BRICS after Bolsonaro pulled out, but very much involved with South Africa, India, Russia, China, in creating an alternate economy for the world.
I mean, that's an interesting point, and I just wanted to remind you, your colleague Cassandra told me I should tell you this is a recorded interview, just for your information. I mean, President Lula is particularly interesting, I think, because he's a representative of this so-called multipolar world of the BRICS states, which is in a confrontation with the new Cold War world, you can say, of the United States. And what's your impression there? Is the multipolar world going to prevail, the Lula world, or are we heading into this darkness of a new absurdity of a Cold War?
I agree with you. I see where you're going. I happen to I think we align on that point. It's up to the United States. It's up to the United States. Russia and China are simply doing what they do, business. The United States is the one that's being aggressive here and blowing up pipelines and trying to subvert Russia at every turn, and China now with a trade. But Russia is my main concern because I can see it coming. I see the commitment that's grown in this country towards Ukraine, which seems to me unthought. It's not reasoned out. It's not thought out. So America has committed itself to this NATOization of Ukraine, which makes no sense considering the history of NATO and where the 1990 agreements were drawn. Were not drawn up, but they were talked about. America committed to those commitments, Baker and Bush, and they said, and also this Schultz, they said that United States would, if Germany was reunited and East Germany was let go and become part of NATO, that would be okay. But the idea was that no more NATO east of Germany, of East Germany. And that's what happened. So what happened is the United States, in the next administration of Clinton, broke that promise and absorbed over the next 20 years 13 new countries into NATO. Border, right on the border of Russia, so pushing right up to the border. I mean, you couldn't be more naked in your aggression, like putting missiles right into Canada or Mexico. This is what they're doing. The Ukraine has been warned. That was a big point. That was a red line for Russia. They said no NATO in Ukraine. And even today, Blinken, the Secretary of State, made this again today, yesterday, made the comment that yes, we are committed to bringing NATO into Ukraine in the as soon as possible, and with all the modern equipment we're going to put into Ukraine. That's been more or less what he said. Thank you very much. That really helps the situation. It's the most vulnerable point for Russia. They don't want to have the United States breathing down their neck on all sides, and that's what they have. So they're very sensitive about this, and they fought for it, and they warned us, and they did go to war over it. We didn't listen.
What do you think?
We didn't listen because we're very arrogant, and we don't listen to Russia. We don't even talk to Russia right now.
I mean, I observe it from Switzerland, and it seems totally absurd. I mean, we were in 1990. It was the fall of the Iron Curtain. Putin was stretching out his hand. Everybody was happy. We thought we get into a new world, and it's somehow.
You remember.
What's the reason why this whole thing fell apart?
That's a very good question, and I've addressed it, but I've been misinterpreted so many times. I'm glad that I can talk to somebody who's got seems like a realist. You seem like a person who remembers the history. But when you talk to American media, they don't have a sense of history. They don't have a sense that we made a deal. America made a lot of deals. We made deals with Russia on NATO. We made deals with them on the intermediate missile. And we made deals with them on the ballistic missiles, which back in the 1970s. And we broke both those agreements, those nuclear agreements, INF and the ballistic missile, defensive ballistic ABM, right? Sorry. We broke both those deals. Russia is out in the cold, and we said, fuck you, that's it, we're ripping it up. And by the way, Russia has a huge nuclear arsenal, and it's not as sophisticated perhaps as ours or as precise, but it certainly is heavy. And if what bothers me deeply is that the United States doesn't seem to understand what a war is, that a war could happen very easily now, that what the United States has done for the last 4 years of the Biden administration is provoke the Soviets, provoke Russia, provoke, poke them, poke the bear. Why? Because apparently we want to weaken Russia. This is the strategy. What strategy is that? That's basically a state of war. You're saying we want to weaken you. That's like trying to destroy you. We want to get rid of Putin. We want to replace your administration with our guy, like Yeltsin used to be. And we want, I've heard talk about dividing Russia up into three zones or 4 zones. It's crazy talk and makes no sense because we can't do anything about it. And on top of it, we would be blown up to pieces if we did it, if we tried to do it. So if America thinks it can get away with poking Russia and not get hurt, they're dreaming. They're dreaming. And where does this come from? This comes from the neoconservative movement that started up here in America and has always been anti-Soviet, anti-Russian. And you know the people involved. They were the ones who got us into wars in Iraq and Libya, and they're the expansionists, the ones that want a strong America that's always challenging the Russians and the Chinese. This is what they want. But you can't challenge somebody who's got the goods. They have the goods. and we don't. We don't even have a military that is ready to go to war. But we're certainly ready to use the Ukrainian military as fodder, cannon fodder. And it's sad what's going on because the Ukrainians have been, a Ukrainian nation has been created in our heads that is the beacon of democracy in Eastern Europe, which it is not, never has been. It's a corrupt state.
You have famously been to Vietnam. I've just returned from Vietnam. My wife is from Hue. I visited the town. You have been there 1968 when the Battle of Hue raged. And when I read the books about this event and you witnessed it, it was striking how the Americans got it wrong at the time. And if you look at the situation now, how the West, the Americans, but also the European leaders are talking about Vladimir Putin. I mean, he's the epitome of evil. It's like they were talking about Ho Chi Minh in those days. No diplomacy, only weapons. You have met Vladimir Putin, you have talked to him. How do you see him today in the light of probably also this new interview by Tucker Carlson, by your observations in the war, by your experience? How do you see Vladimir Putin today, and what do we get wrong, or what do they, the proponents of war, what do they get wrong about him?
Well, the one thing they get wrong about him is that they make him into a Hitler, a Saddam, somebody who's dangerous, who has plans for expansion in the West. I have never felt that, never even talk about it. His goal, as he talks very clearly about Ukraine, if you remember in our documentary, the Putin interviews, very clearly. He goes on about it more than once, and he says how important it is that we understand Russian relationship with Ukraine. And if you remember correctly, it used to be a neutral government till 2014, when there was a coup d'etat, to some degree, to a large degree, orchestrated by the United States. The neoconservative Newland was in office, and she went over there and made a lot of trouble. And Biden went over there, and John McCain went over there, and the NAD went over there, the National Endowment for NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, spent a lot of money with George Soros to create a coup in. All of a sudden, Ukraine said we no longer need to be neutral. We can be anti-Russian, and why that is so? When Russia was willing to trade, had made a great trade deal with Ukraine. Actually, Ukraine wanted a better trade deal. They went to the EU, and they couldn't get it. They couldn't get as good a deal. So that was why there was a hitch. And everybody said, well, the Russians are preventing Ukraine from going to the EU. No, it was just that it made more sense for Russia. If Ukraine made a deal with the EU, you can't import EU items through Ukraine into Russia for free, which was what the old trade agreement was about. It was Russia had no duties on that trade. So it's all been fucked up and confused. But there's essentially. The coup happened because it was orchestrated, and young people wanted to be part of the West. Okay, fine. There was quite a lot of them, and we understand that. But that was not the implication. What happened was that it was a violent coup, and there was shots fired. And frankly, it's been. I don't want to get into all that detail, but the evidence looks like it was fired. But there were the people who fired the shots were from hired agitators by the United States CIA and by the Ukrainian Secret Service. They fired on the students and on the policemen, killed quite a few, and got away with it because there was confusion, quite a lot of chaos. That led to the flight from Ukraine of the president, who
Yanukovych.
was Yanukovych, who I interviewed, and I produced the movie Ukraine on Fire about that whole situation, and we interviewed Yanukovych as well as several people in the Ukrainian system who filled us in on the intelligence services of the Ukraine and the United States' involvement. So
you had the
this whole thing.
sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you had a very interesting conversation with the American podcaster Lex Friedman 1 year after the Russians invaded Ukraine. And your perception at the time was that was a mistake by Putin to invade. There were made some mistakes, misunderstandings. And let me come up with a provocative question, because I thought about this event a lot of times, and you are actually not allowed to say this in Europe. You get decapitated any moment. But I was thinking, was this war really avoidable? I mean, what should he have done in that moment when you see 8 years artillery bombardment of the Russian minority? You see the Americans, stepping in with their NATO into Ukraine. Do you see that differently now, or would you still say it was a huge mistake by Putin, or was it somehow terribly enough an inevitable war as it played out?
Well, that's a very good question because, frankly, I'm not a Russian defense minister or defense advisor, and I don't know exactly what the measurements are for if you put the kind of weapons that America is giving to Ukraine now, if you put them into Ukraine, how dangerous they would be to the Russian country. Now, that has to be measured because, as far as I don't think my statement was correct back then. I think my statement was wrong because I didn't understand what Russians understand, is that how dangerous this was, that if Ukraine were able to be so anti-Russian and be able to bring all this kind of military equipment in, the next step would have been to kill all the Donbass Russians and bring back what is Ukrainian? I mean, frankly, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, learned how to speak Ukrainian recently. So there's, he grew up speaking Russian. So I don't understand, this whole Ukrainian sovereignty. Fine. That's fine with Putin because he allowed for the Orange Revolution to happen in 2004, if you remember correctly. So the Ukraine has had Orange leadership. And NED has been all of Ukraine, Soros. They've been propagating their propaganda. The point is that at a certain place, Ukraine has become a Western proxy. It's no longer, the people don't know what's going on. The people simply want to survive and they want to live and they want to have good lives. And when the coup happened, as you know, the Russian-speaking minority, if you call it a minority, did not want to have a government that was pro-Western like they were, that had Nazi, had fascists in it, had the Azov Brigade as well as other units, military units, and they were right away. There was, if you remember, conflict when they came in. There was people being killed in Odessa. They killed a bunch of.
It was a massacre.
Massacre in Odessa. There was massacres of pro-Russian speakers everywhere. There was also a picking up of in the Donbass. There was a separate government tried to come in and say we had nothing to do with this coup. We would like to have our autonomy at least. We want to be respected. And they asked to join Russia at that time. And Putin said no, he wanted them to negotiate. And that led to Minsk I and Minsk II. They were trying to work out an agreement between Ukrainians and Russian-speaking minority for the east of Ukraine, and Donbass particularly, and Luhansk. And that negotiation went on for years, but it was by the admission of the Germans and the French. Now they're saying that was just a ruse, a trick to
buy time.
Buy time for the Ukrainian army to get armed by the United States, which is what happened at NATO. So
how do you think will this all play out? I mean, the question now is the tides of war have a bit changed. 1 year ago, it looked probably a bit more difficult for the Russians. Now they seem to advance on all fronts. There seems to be another strategic failure probably of the West. do you think that the Americans and the Europeans, the NATO countries, they will accept that Putin wins militarily, or do you see
I don't
kind
know.
of a
This is very
confrontation, a
dangerous.
nuclear confrontation even?
This is what makes it very dangerous. It's about pride, isn't it? It's like World War I situation. It's like pride is more important than the reality. First of all, we shouldn't even be there. And why Ukraine has become so important to us is because we put money into it, and so much money. Now it's become a major issue. Like all of a sudden, it's like Taiwan or something like, or put it this way, it becomes like a major symbol, and that's where it's scary because the Russians are not going to back down. You see, look at it this way: if you put in that whole Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are certainly good fighters, like the Russians, they are Russian in a way, and so there is a strong. They're strong, and it's become a civil war between Russians and Ukrainians in a sense. But they started killing people in the Donbass, and they killed a lot. Estimates of about 5,000 to 7,000 Donbass wanting sovereignty for the Donbass and Luhansk. That is the arrangement that was not working. So the fighting was pretty serious, and the artillery was being used, and sides. It was World War One positional lines were formed in the Donbass, and who knows how many people were really killed, but it was cruel. It was very cruel. People that the Ukrainians passed a law for a bit banning Russian. They were very radical. They wanted to go into Crimea. They started to attack Crimea, but the Crimean people also had no desire to be part of the pro-Western alliance, and there was no violence in Crimea, if you remember correctly, because
there was
the soldiers were not, the Ukrainian soldiers were not interested in fighting against their brothers.
I mean, the difficult thing today is that, I mean, speaking out of Europe, you know Europe well. You have friends in all over the place. Your mother was from France. You used the term a wall of propaganda, that you haven't seen anything before, this one-sided perspective. And
shocked.
I think this gets increasingly worse. I mean, it's almost as if free speech was killed in Europe. I don't know about the United States. Probably it's a bit better with Elon Musk and Twitter. What's your assessment there? What's the propagandistic element at the moment on our side in this war?
It's just a total brainwash. There are people in America who speak about an alternate reality, which is what we have here. But in the mainstream message is uniform and very, very, very strong in the sense of censoring people who go against it. So they're very sensitive in America to if Ukraine is being presented as a revolutionary country with like the American Revolution or something, and very democratic, and they're being oppressed by this. It's a one-sided point of view, and it's an artificial, and it's not even true because there are so many Nazis in Ukraine that we can't even call it a revolution, a good revolution. It's a Nazi, a Nazi,
ultra-nationalist kind of.
Yeah, but it's nationalistic is the better word, because Nazi gives the vibration of or to an anti-Jewish. No, it's really nationalistic, but very anti-Russian. You see, because that has always been the issue. Russia was bigger than Ukraine. They took over, and the famine in Ukraine. There's always a beef about Russia, and that's true about all these Eastern European countries, whether it's, the Baltics are the worst. You know, they say the Russians did all these horrible things, but again, there's a lot of propaganda here. But,
in an interview you made with our newspaper a few years ago, after you made your documentary about Vladimir Putin, you said, and we used this as a title on the interview. You said, Vladimir Putin is the most rational guy, a rational person in this circus of madmen governing the world. Would you still say that if you look at the leadership of the West, if you look at the leadership of the United States, that somehow, with all its downsides and the aggression and everything, the war, would you still say that Putin is a rational guy here in this strange, heated
Absolutely.
atmosphere?
First of all, look at it from Putin's point of view. You have a if you had a fully armed Ukraine right now, killing Russians in Donbass and in Luhansk and trying to get Crimea back, you'd have a worse situation because they would really be fully armed and you'd have to go in there and be much bloodier. He acted at that point because he felt like he could still control the situation in Donbass. And he did. And frankly, he did well. And he called it a special operation. But it was portrayed in the West as the beginning of the Hitler regime. It was not true because he had limited goals. He never went after the Ukraine. He never had a goal for Kiev even. He just had a goal to take over the Donbass because that was the autonomous region he was concerned about. And people were being killed. He had evidence of it. And there was a European group, I forgot the name of it, but it was an organization. They testified to these deaths that there was at least 5,000, maybe 7,000 people in Donbass. I think probably more.
Yes, well, I think it was even 14,000. It was between 2014 and 22.
These are people, being killed by artillery, being butchered at night by Chechens who come over and whatever, did some dirty work with knives. It's been a pretty rough war. They're tough people.
And what do you think? Whole Europe is somehow not existing in this whole situation. Everybody looks to the United States, and the United States seem to be in a certain state of uproar. The polarization is extreme. What's happening in the United States? How do you see this whole process that's coming?
I'm shocked that Europe folded, so to speak, so quickly, like in a poker game. Just folded. I can't believe there was no resistance to the United States bullying. The United States bullying NATO into this war. Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, was saying outrageous things. Biden was out of line saying that Putin was a butcher and stuff like that. And he hated Putin way back in the 80s, 90s. He's been anti-Russian since the beginning. He's a Cold Warrior, never changed. I was fooled by him. I thought he had gotten older and I didn't realize he was so. But he went over to Ukraine, by the way. And not only that, his son benefited from the Ukrainian deal. He was telling the Ukrainian corruption, the minister who was investigating corruption.
Was the general counsel of the government that he was kicked out. Was
removed at Biden's request. So don't tell me he wasn't involved. He was very involved in Ukraine.
And now we got to a presidential election, and there are people in Europe saying that Donald Trump is the last hope of Western civilization. Would you agree with that assessment?
No, I don't agree with that. Because Trump is a dangerous man too. Look at him. He calls his enemies fascists, and then he calls them communists. I'm confused. Who's again? Communists are left-wingers. Come on. He's also said outrageous things about Israel, pro-Israel, and he's certainly no friend to the Palestinians. As far as I know, he did a lot of harm to them, and he's no friend to Iran. He's made threats on Iran. You're looking at a potential madman here. So if we have a nuclear war with Iran as opposed to Russia, is that better? I can't think so. I think it's crazy.
Do you think we are closer to a nuclear war than like 1 year before?
And I finish my thought here because I never thought so until what happened in Europe. When when the war started in February of 2022, the Europeans, one after the other, sounded just like the United States. They were saying the same things. They jumped in and they said, "This is outrageous. It's like a war of bully against some kind of person who has to be a bully. Russia is a bully and the Ukraine is a democratic society." Bullshit. Then Sweden fell in, Finland fell into the NATO. I was shocked by all this. because there used to be some resistance in Europe. What happened to Chirac and Schroeder, Germany and France? At least they objected to the Iraq War. Who's objecting to this war? That don't they see it where the United States is going? I mean, they had monitors on the ground. They could have gotten the information. They knew about the Donbass situation, and they went along with the we're blind story. The story that the Russia was breaking the rules, the internet order, and all that shit. International order was broken by so many times by the United States in these nuclear treaties, and in Iraq, and in Libya, and in Syria. The United States has been breaking the rules whenever it wants, and I can't believe that this kind of
and where is the silver lining at the end of excuse me? Yes.
Suppression of dissenting thought is not been allowed.
No.
It's a terrible situation. Why? You asked me. I don't know what happened to Europe. I can't understand the reasoning of Macron, who thinks that Russia is a bigger threat. Russia has moved very reasonably slowly to consolidate its goals in Ukraine. I've never seen any interest in going beyond that. Felt it because I don't think Russia wants a war with NATO, and they know that's coming. So, because the United States is not rational in this, they won't talk to the Russians. There's no diplomacy going on. Lavrov has said this many times, and the United States doesn't talk. They don't communicate. What they do is, I guess maybe the CIA is talking to the Russians. I hope so, but I'm not sure even of that anymore. Biden has. I would not vote for Biden for that reason only, because I think that's the greatest issue facing the world today is nuclear war. I mean, climate change is the biggest one, but let's say nuclear war, a limited nuclear war between Russia and the United States is in nobody's interest. Nobody's interest. And that's where we're climbing to, because the United States keeps saying, if we lose in Ukraine, and this is what Blinken said yesterday, we're not going to lose, but if we lose, we're going to be with you, Ukraine, all the way to the end. We're going to stick with you. We're going to arm you. We're going to make you a member of NATO. Whatever is left of Ukraine is going to go into NATO, and this situation will continue for years. This is crazy. This is so crazy. I mean, why do we have we have a stake in Ukraine? It's.
I mean, you mentioned in several conversations and also in your movie work, John F. Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy was the president who saved the world from a nuclear confrontation in 1962. To finish our conversation, is there any hope in this rather dark picture that we are seeing here? Are new Kennedys around? Are there politicians around who would say they can?
I think I'm going to have to vote for the young man who I like very much, Robert Kennedy Jr., because he's actually said the same things I'm saying about Ukraine. He's called the bullshit out, and nobody's really listening to him because they don't want to hear it. And the media outlets that support the United States, and this is a patriotic issue, but it's become the goal of the neoconservatives. That's what we've embraced. We've embraced the neoconservative goal, which is an America that would basically move into Russia and do what we did with Yeltsin in the same years that we had economic control of Russia. This is what they think is reasonable to expect. But they don't understand that the Russian people are united in many ways. And one of the ways they've always been united is in Russia, their love of Russia. This is their motherland. Hitler learned this when he went into Russia. If you remember correctly, the Russians fought back. And they never gave up. They never, ever gave up. They lost a huge amount of people, but they were partisans fighting against the German rear, or in the front they were fighting. The Russians never lost maybe 30 million people in that war, but they kept fighting. This is what is still going on. This is why it doesn't make a difference if communism or capitalism. We know Putin is no communist at all. He hates that. He thought it was a completely irrational system, and he wanted a limited capitalistic system, which is what he has, and they were working towards integrating with the West as well as towards democracy. They were integrating that for those 20 some years that Putin has been in office, more or less, off and on. And all of a sudden it's like the Russians are more dangerous to us, we're saying, than they've ever been. But that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Because when Kennedy dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were fighting over East Germany. We were fighting over Germany. But if you remember correctly, Berlin was a touch point. Cuba was a touch point. Berlin was in Europe. Look where it is. But now the line has moved from Berlin to Ukraine, and we're saying that this is as important as Ukraine, as Berlin was in 1962. I don't buy that. And nobody buys it. If you do any kind of history and reading, you'll see that this is an inflated situation. We're fighting over nothing. We're fighting over a pride, and we're fear of Russian, Chinese empire, BRICS taking over the economic world. Well, that's happening, and it will happen, and nobody's going to stop it unless you go to war. And unfortunately, America should not go to war for trade ever, because economically we may end up as number two, we may end up as number three, we may end up dropping back, but that we're alive and we're part of the world. I don't see what's wrong with that. We don't have to be the bully. We don't have to be the dominant factor. We talk about a hegemonic world, a world where the United States is in control. That's not realistic anymore. The world is multipolar, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to accept that. I don't understand. I don't understand why we can't accept it unless you're only if you're some kind of frozen conservative in this country, and you see any foreigner as the danger. Would you think that? And I think that's the problem is the United States has got to educate itself. I thought I was
And what's for you personally the best news, the silver lining in this whole situation? What gives you hope?
And what's scary is that we don't seem to realize what a war is. You see, I've been to war. I know it would really be destructive to not only our economy, but our society, our civilization, even a limited war. And I don't think that people understand it. I mean, they had 9/11, they had 2001, and they talk about it, but that's not the real war that we should worry about.
To go back to President Lula, is he probably one of those politicians who can create with others together a better world?
Well, Lula has come out for a truce in Ukraine, and he certainly understands the two-sidedness of the viewpoints. He understands the Ukrainian point of view, and he understands the Russian point of view. And he was a great peacemaker in his previous terms when he was in office. He tried to get involved in the Iraq situation with the United States, and he got chased out of it. He talks about that. So Hillary Clinton chased him out, didn't want anything to do with peace, and don't want him involved in any kind of peace. That's so different than what used to be in the old days. Remember when they had respect for the UN, when Utah and Dag Hammarskjöld, although they killed him probably. So, there's just... the United States talks about a world order, and yet the head of the UN, the Mexican chief, made a beautiful speech about peace and about dealing with this Ukraine situation correctly. The United States doesn't give it any notice to the UN. And it's so sad that we've lost our anchor, and somehow we're unmoored, and we're in waters we don't understand, and we're in the Black Sea we don't understand.
And even Switzerland is not as neutral anymore as it used to be.
Well, why? What is wrong? Are we going to?
According to me, it's some kind of mass psychosis in our leadership. It's like a self-hypnosis that they're talking themselves into this new kind of absurd Cold War. And I mean, you have made a film about Richard Nixon. You are not a fan of Richard Nixon, but Richard Nixon had the greatness to shake hands with Mao because he saw the necessity that the great powers have to sit together, that to have to overcome their ideological strives. And the problem is we don't have these kind of politicians anymore, these realists.
No,
But we have still great filmmakers such as you.
I don't understand I don't understand what's her name, the Merkel. I don't
Yes.
understand what she was doing. And she said that she admitted that it was a ruse. The
Yeah.
Minsk II was not. They were not legitimate in their aspirations for peace. Germany. I
Mhm.
don't understand this guy Scholz at all. And here the United States blows up his pipeline, and
Yeah.
there's no sense of sovereignty or self. Sovereignty is the key, and that's where De Gaulle goes. I'm going back to way back to when I was young. There was a Europe that was fighting back. It was sovereign, and now that's gone. The English are behaving like Doberman pinchers of the America, working for America, and France now too. I mean, I can't understand Macron saying these things.
Mm.
He's going to send French troops into Ukraine is insane.
Mhm.
In, Losing one life for Ukraine is insane.
Mm. Well, I think our time is up. Many thanks for
I hope I
your.
was clear. Please relay my message correctly, because otherwise, I get into trouble. But I know that you agree with me, so.
No, it's I thank you for your honesty, and I think it's also important that people with such an experience like you, that they speak up. And I mean, you have the first-hand insight. You talk to these people. You were in the war yourself. You have experience. You're not the theoretical person. So
I'm
thank you very much.
I'm 77 years old. I've been around. So I should say something. I mean, a man who's lived this long and seen as much as I have an obligation to speak, and I can't
Mhm.
speak in my country. I'm speaking to a Swiss journalist.
Is that so? I mean, this is also a very interesting issue, the so-called deep state. I always thought that was like an ideological construction, but if you look at the Twitter files and all these developments, I mean, is there some kind of, secret service, deep state organization which makes even your life harder in the United States? What's your experience there?
So I think so, but I can't tell you exactly the details because I do think that they've cut me off from the communications. I
Okay.
can't, I can't get the big, I can't get big media outlets. They
Mm,
don't report it. They just don't report it.
mm,
Don't report it. And this is it's quite a change in my life. Yeah, I
mm,
really, I was a hero for a while. I had medals and all that from Vietnam, and
mm.
now I'm on the shit list. But so are other
Well, you
people.
have 3 Oscars and 11 Oscar nominations. You made a lot of great films.
But truthfully, I've been cut off. Been cut
Mm.
off. Even my documentaries, there was no distribution for the nuclear documentary. There was none for the JFK revisited documentary.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm
And in the United States, I mean, there is really, I mean, you're somehow attacked or sidelined or canceled by some media, etc.
yeah.
Well, in
And
Switzerland, you're always welcome. I mean, we would host anytime a big public interview with you on all these issues because it's so interesting. Also, your historical experience in Vietnam. I think the Vietnam experience is it's so contemporary. I mean, I just read the book by Mark Bowden about Hue 1968. I mean, that's a fantastic book. I don't know whether you know it about and I mean, it mirrors a lot of stuff we are witnessing today.
well, I certainly can. I would disagree with Bowden about some stuff, but he was the guy who did the Black Hawk Down thing.
Right.
Yeah, but he's be careful where you go there. The Way was a fake battle in the sense that it did happen, but that was not where the
Yeah.
geographic center was. The goal is the Jap who
Hmm.
after
The
the war
general.
they wanted to cut Saigon. That was the key. That's where
Hmm.
the 25th Infantry. We were right next to Saigon, above it. They came from Cambodia down. That was the plan. That's where they put all their weight. So the caisson was a feint. What they
Hmm.
aim with the left, hit with the right. That was the big invasion, and he can't even get that right.
Hmm.
Saying is that
Amazing.
Battle of Wei. It was about the Battle of Saigon.
Ja.
It's about. And if they had succeeded in cutting the country in half, it would have been in Saigon. That was the key, not Wei. What was I going to say? Anyway, good luck to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Stone, and lots of success with your new movie, and in Cannes, all the best.
Yeah, let's hope for the good guys. Let's try to get through this. But hopefully we'll be talking in a year. Because
Absolutely.
it's going to be. What's sad about this whole thing is if we do end up on the other side of life, if we end up dead or something or maimed, or it would be such a waste because nothing happened that was really bad. It wasn't like we had killing of Jews or this or that. It was a world that was carrying on and it was ultimately prosperous and succeeding. And here we turned this into a major nightmare. Biden has.
Yeah.
I really resent him for this, and I will campaign against him. But this is much more dangerous than the American people and the European people know. Much more. Because America is too prideful and too arrogant. So the moment we don't get our way in Ukraine, we're going to be very nasty. That's what I've, very nasty. Good luck to you, Roger.
Good luck to you, and let's see whether we can have a conversation in 1 year and the outlook is better than today.
I would promise you that. Don't laugh about it. Seriously.
I'm a Protestant optimist. We always think that at the end will somehow be safe, but that's just like a conception. We don't know whether it's happening.
Really hope to see you again.
Okay, hope to see you. Great talking to you. Many thanks. I mean, you are one of my heroes. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.